Hey everyone, so I've gotten, this general type of comment under a few videos recently, and at first I didn't know if this was something that needed to be talked about a bit, but I guess we can, which is basically going, but Chara, if you want all these buffs, why are you advocating for so many nerfs recently? Aren't we just entering a cycle where we advocate for buff, and then when thing gets buffed, we go, we need nerf now? Like basically that line of thought, And everyone's gonna have their own, balance ideas that they want for the game and such. But I feel like I have very consistently been wanting more buffs than nerfs, and I have advocated that patches needed to do larger buffs, which I still stand by, obviously. But I guess what I haven't talked about enough, and is the subject of today's video, what do you do after we actually do the big buffs, like with Heavy and Dynamo Roller? So, while I want, giant buffs to, weapons to make them more interesting, especially if they're lower down, once you do that, you can't just give it, drastic buffs and then call it a day and then go retire from game balancing and leave the weapon as it is. We have to take a look at if we overdid anything or see how this weapon plays, because fundamentally, large buffs could change how a weapon operates in a way to where it now has to be reevaluated. Let's use this thing for an example, right? And let's take a look at some usage data real quick. This is a compilation of top 500 Splat Zones X-Rank data in 11.0 that we have so far. If you take a look at this chart, you might notice that Heavy is extremely inflated. Now, you can make the argument that recency bias plays a factor on this list. And that's true. I mean, I don't think Dynamo would have this many people without the recency bias that the weapon hasn't been good for 8 years. But even if we were being as generous as possible, let's say that, 20 people playing the weapon right now in top 500, almost half the data was purely because of recency bias, and edit would drop down, and Heavy Smiling would drop down to 32 weapon users. It would still be at an absolutely ridiculous position in the top. It is 100% overused at this level of play. It is a problem. There's no getting around it. Statistically, this is insane, right? Because we gave it a 23% increase to its paint. This made it the best painting weapon in the game. It can outpaint Neo Splash despite having a special that doesn't paint, And we've been seeing people do it a lot. It's 1 out of every 10 players in top 500 zones, the most competitive ranked mode. That's a little bit insane. So, we have to tweak it because of that. If you buff things drastically, you can overdo it. And Heavy's an example of it. We gave it too much paint. And you can debate how we want to tone that down, but we have fundamentally changed the weapon's identity in a way that has caused new problems. And these new problems need to be solved. Another reason, though, is the classic game design attribute. So this is where I talked about V-Blaster a lot to the point where I did its own video. And, since I talked about it, I'll keep it long story short. But Blaster's entire competitive balance history has been not just making it better, but also distinguishing it more from similar options like Luna. Again, in S1, these had similar speeds and the same blast radius. Now, Blaster is much faster than Luna. In exchange, it's supposed to have a smaller blast radius, which is why I disagree so heavily with the radius increase that it got recently. I think that it messes with the weapon's identity. When designing this weapon, I feel like it has a niche of being very fast, for the 2-shot indirect blasters, and in exchange, it's supposed to have a small blast radius to deal with that. I don't have a problem with the 2-frame buff added to it. I think it's a little crazy when they already did 7 before, but okay, this is the direction we're going with the weapon, that's fine. But then if we go and we buff the blast radius back to where it used to be, we lose some of that weapon direction. For an example of this done in a way that I think was good in terms of nerfs, we can take a look at S-Blast. S-Blast originally had the largest blast radius of outside blasters, of short-range blasters, with its short-range mode. But they committed to changing its identity a bit to where this would be the shorter-range one. And I think that makes sense, that Luna Blaster, Clash Blaster should have larger radiuses than this weapon in close-range mode, given, that has this, and yada yada yada. And S-Blast has been relatively fine. And I think this has been a good way to tweak it, because S-Blast's skill floor has been properly adjusted. The weapon now requires a significant degree of difficulty to use, which was always supposed to be the point of the weapon when you have a long-range mode that, is like this. So when we buff a weapon by too much, instead of just toning it back, by just, messing with the number a little bit. So for example, we could see the next patch and they could just go, all right, heavy, instead of painting 23% better total than it did before, will now only paint like 15% better than before 11.0. You could do a simple numbers tweak, or you could do a change, that opts to work around this new identity. So the ink efficiency changes I mentioned, for example. Heavy getting an ink efficiency nerf would never be something you would consider before this patch change. But if the devs like the idea that heavy paints this much, if they want that to be a core part of the weapon's identity, then even if this number is overtuned, they might want to balance around it in a different way. And that's the way I am proposing, for example, right? Last thing to talk about a little bit, in terms of examples of this, is overtuned radius stuff. This is what Ultra Stamp is right now, right? Where I think everyone can agree the buff for Stamp was kind of interesting in concept because throw mode was, kind of mediocre before. Making it a reasonable threat was interesting. But also the hitbox is just really big and dumb, and it's a little bit too much. And so it should be toned back for that reason. This is the common, but I guess Kyo's calling it a buzzword now, overtuned, right? The idea of what overtuning something is that one attribute of it is toned in a way to where it is too high, even if it doesn't break the weapon or anything. It's like this attribute of the weapon is too strong. They've tweaked the number too high or tuned it too high. That's kind of where that word comes from. So 11.0 was a patch that experimented a lot more with buffs because they did things like aura and the hitbox changes, and they did big buffs to weapons like dynamo and heavy spiraling. And I like the fact that they experimented with it. I praised it back then, and I'll praise it now. I think it was a very good thing that they did that. But just because they do that doesn't mean we can just go, okay, well now they did all the buffs we want, we can just leave these weapons alone, they're good now. We still have to look at what the after effects of that are. And fundamentally, I still think that this is worth it, because I think, yes, if buffing a weapon requires that we have to tone it back in a different way a month later, I think that's better than waiting for 5 years for a weapon to be good because we just went a little bit at a time every patch over, the course of several years. I think that that trade-off is worth it. But if I'm going to advocate for, this semblance of a lot of big buffs, and they go, oh no, but don't nerf anything that we buff like that, we're bound to create some problems. I think if you're someone who wants a lot of buffs, and you want drastic buffs, you have to also be willing to make sure that weapons that get overbuffed, which will inevitably happen from that balance philosophy, also are able to be, adjusted. So no, I don't think me advocating for nerfs for a few of the 11.0 stuff that we're doing messes with the balance philosophy that I've had before. Because again, the weapons are still ending up overall positive, and the overall drastic buffs are still staying. Even the nerfs that I'm proposing for any of these weapons that I've talked about still leave them in a drastically better spot than they were before the patch. So I think that's fair. I hope this is a better explanation of that, so hopefully this answers the comments for those who had it, and I hope this was all able to make sense. Thank you for watching.